was dead. He was like as yellow as a Simpsons character. Less than 24 hours, he was already buried. Whether we call it the soul or consciousness or any of these things, there is much more depth and complexity to it. Russia took a perspective of trying to understand this consciousness aspect of it. The US half was to engineer and use technology to circumvent the consciousness aspect. If you open the book, to the first scan is a pink piece of paper. That is a visual indicator of something that is classified. Here it is. Here's what we've got. Figure it out.
Welcome back to Beyond Top Secret by UAP Reporting Center. I'm Joe, and joining me is Gene Sticco, author of Engineering Infinity. After the passing of Gene's father-in-law, a physicist in the former Soviet Union, Gene says he and his wife Natalia uncovered boxes of notes, technical drawings, and sketches that may point towards alleged Soviet UFO reverse engineering programs buried deep behind the Iron Curtain. Since discovering these documents, he's been trying to piece them together and understand what these documents could mean for the mystery of UFOs and the path to disclosure. Gene, welcome to Beyond Top Secret. How are you today?
Good, thanks. Appreciate you having me. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for coming on and thanks for making time for us. The subject that we're going to be talking about is fascinating. It could have major implications for how we move forward with disclosure. So for people hearing your name for the first time, who is Gene Sticco? What did you do before all this? And how did you end up getting pulled into the world of UFOs?
Yeah, good place to start. So I'm a retired Air Force veteran, intel contractor. I had about 9 years in the Air Force, from 99 till my formal retirement in 2027. I worked as an intel contractor inside the oil and gas industry. So I had jobs in the industry, but worked with a number of agencies through that for a number of purposes over those years. I worked and lived globally. Sort of easier to ask where I haven't been as opposed to where I have been. My expertise was around geopolitical and transnational security risk management when it came to protecting energy infrastructure in the nations where the companies operated. And I was to sort of go between companies, intel agencies of the nations in which those companies were registered, and the intel, military, and public safety organizations of the nations in which we operated. Retired in 2017, and shortly thereafter actually became a corporate whistleblower after being contacted by a law firm that was representing a community in Nigeria, was looking to file a suit against Shell Oil in the UK. I was brought into that, and in the course of that, kind of became a whistleblower, exposing some of the inside activities as it related to Shell's footprint in Nigeria and what was going on there. That went all the way to the UK Supreme Court. And it's actually, the case is still ongoing. In 2018, early 2018, I met my now wife, Natalia, while I was over in Eastern Europe, sort of finishing up some business, tying up some loose ends, as we say. That's where we met and had the whirlwind romance that led to our marriage later in 2018. And bringing her back to the U.S. Along with her son, my stepson. And in 2019, late December, she was having a conversation with her father. He was living in Kazakhstan. He talking about our son, his interest in aerospace sciences and engineering. And he casually said, I'm going to send you some of my old work he might be interested in someday. He sent it. With it, we had never opened it. Within weeks, he was dead. He actually died December 30th, 2019. And it was shortly thereafter that we opened the documents, started going through them, and were astounded to find very, short of a part of the story appeared to be the detailed reverse engineering of a UFO. And this was his, what seemed to be him working through the science. So there's a lot of technical depth to it. There's a lot of physics, math, and sort of explaining how this whole thing works and is operated.
Wow. Sorry to hear about your wife's father's passing. If I could just ask, was he sick at the time? Was his death sudden? Or do you think it could have been related?
Well, with everything going on now, right, it gets thrown into question. So we had no indication that he was ill, right? The first sign we had was the sort of phone call a couple of weeks before he passed that he was very sick. He was in the hospital, every couple of days, a new development, organ failure, a liver failure, kidney failure. His girlfriend had sent Nat a photo of him, and he was like as yellow as a Simpsons character. And then by the time Nat got word he had died, I'm talking like less than 24 hours. I have the number 17 hours in my head, which is probably what I had calculated at the time, but like he was already buried, right?
Wow.
So there was no chance to, even say goodbye really, because it seemed to escalate so fast. That being said, subsequent to diving into these documents, investigating, sort of putting out the call, trying to put more structure, around the story in the background. A friend of his on his social media, when she announced the death, said a prolonged illness. We've tried reaching out, and contacting this person because that would sort of indicate he knew he was sick for a long time, or is 2 weeks a prolonged illness. It's like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. And if you, not trying to make something out of nothing, but if you follow geopolitics in Eastern Europe, you know how prevalent poisoning is by intelligence services and stuff in that part of the world.
Yeah, right. And it's, again, it's like so many things, right? There's a case, right? There's a case to be made. There's also the case to be made. The guy didn't take the best care of himself anyway. It was sort of on a self-destructive path to begin with. So, it's one of those things. Could be natural. If it wasn't natural, wouldn't have taken all that much of a push to make it, to go that way. Not only within the context of what we know is going on now and the focus in the U.S. on these scientists, he had actually, again, subsequent to all of our research, he had released these documents in 2012. So there's a 7-year window there of him on a Russian social media site sharing the documents, expressing his anger and frustration, at Gorbachev, at Putin, at the system, at the West, at the Jews. All of this is sort of in there. And the recognition, people saying to him, hey, this is dangerous. And him writing back, well, I know it's dangerous, but it's out there. It's public. It's, so in the grand context of things, it's a question that will, certainly remain unanswered, but also kind of fits patterns.
Absolutely. And in this world, when there's coincidences like that, a lot of the time they tend not to be coincidences. So like you said, we'll probably never know the answer. but it's certainly worth talking about the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially as far as the timing goes. They could have been watching him from 2012. It died down maybe a little bit after that, and now the issue starts to get raised again when he's sending you the documents. Who knows? But speaking of the documents,
yep.
Engineering Infinity, Earth's first interstellar blueprint. If you can tell the audience who aren't familiar, what is this book and what's in it?
So this was the straight attempt to just share what we had. We published that in 2024. We had these in our possession for 4 years. Over the course of those years, reached out to everybody and anybody to try and figure out what these were. Were they a quirky family heirloom, or was it something, of value to scientific discourse? Was it, again, something relevant to the UAP issue, right? Again, an issue I only had a very basic ancillary. If it came across the screen, I'd watch it, but I never sought out knowledge of what was going on and all that. So, I saw every headline that was a headline and read about it and moved on with life. So this wasn't anything I was familiar with. Now, over the course of those 4 years, I became educated in it, began seeking out who's who, what's what, what's going on. Again, we can talk about that 2012 timeline in Russia. Then you got 2017. Then he dies in 2019. So all that stuff, right, starts put in there. My effort during those 4 years was focused on, number one, understanding actually the content. Natalia could tell me what the words were, right? But she's not a physicist. I'm not a physicist. I'm sure you open up a physics book, you can read every word in there. Now explain it to me, right? That's similarly what she's trying to do through that. But one of the standout things that was in there was what we call the 2024 prediction. There's a large amount of this work that is focused on consciousness and how consciousness interacts with the craft. It's sort of the third key to operating the craft. And he goes through civilization developments and timelines and all this and that. But, and again, with the intelligence background, there's certain information that I have to automatically discount, because at that time, he knew everything that happened up until 2019. So when he talks about 2007 or the rest of it, he knew that, But in this case, he's talking about 2024. So we almost took the position of, all right, I guess we wait and see. And what he was talking about was that there were these cosmic cycles that affect humanity. And then we almost get these cosmic DNA downloads that begin to change certain aspects and begin to advance us into the grander global universal cosmic community. And this is just part of life. But the way he described 2024 and the years preceding and leading up to is that humanity begins to experience this struggle between, as he described it, the oligarchy and the spiritual, and that there's this material, physical, and spiritual aspect of consciousness, and that when the solar system passes through this sixth gate of the Orion arm, 50% of society will experience this shift right away, right? So it's almost as though half of society of humanity is going to get this download, and it starts running right away, and the other half eventually gets there. But all the while, there's this struggle and conflict. So obviously, probably don't need to lay out to anybody, as we're going through 2022, 23, and 24, boy, it felt a lot like what he was writing, you know. And never mind, by that time, I was following the community, and I'm seeing people who are focused on consciousness and the more metaphysical aspects speaking in these same terms. So that was a standout thing in and of itself. I had also begun the work of trying to look at the science, right? Is the things he talks about stuff that anybody actually does? And as I'm doing those assessments, what I call all the regular suspects start popping up. Oh, yes, this branch of, this issue is something that NASA's been working on, since the early 2000s. Oh, this is something DARPA does. That's where I got introduced to the DIRDs. And this is what OSAP was doing. And I'm like, well, that's weird, right? That the idea by the end of 2024 that I was taking this random thing that dropped in our lab and it talks about a UFO, that all of the government programs and contractors that are talked about as being involved in the UFO world are being scientifically connected. And then this whole consciousness aspect. And that was the point I was like, you know what? We just need to push this out, right? We can't bullshit around. So working with another friend of mine that does AI language modeling and things like that, we're like, all right, here's parameters. So let's have a system. Let's run the translation. Natalia, read it. Does it make sense? Do the words align? Because there's a big difference between translation and interpretation. And never mind, we're dealing with science and scientific characters. And are those characters, is a 3 actually a 3, or is it a Cyrillic letter for something else? All of these things are like, and my friend Mario, who's, helping now, he was very much into the issue. So he's like the one who's like, dude, you got to lock these things away. He's like, this, if people find out, you're going to have, like the KGB, the FSB coming after you, you're going to have, and I'm like, really? And he's like, yeah, you need to. So I was.
For those that don't know, the FSB is the new KGB. The KGB turned into the FSB.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So he gave me, I guess, that healthy dose of paranoia. And I was like, so let's put it out there, and then, we'll put it out there with the invitation. Here it is. Here's what we've got. Here's what I'm seeing. Figure it out. I don't know. I don't know what to do with this. And that was the end of 24. And again, continued to try. I think I know I took copies of it. I mailed them to Nancy Mace Burchett. I mailed one to the White House and, tried to put a reasonable letter, attached to it. Like, hey, this is some stuff. And I'm also seeing like the Russian weapon systems, all these connections, patents, things being said in the news. I'm like, there's something here, and I don't know, do they know about this already or whatnot? And that's why I pushed it out the way that I did. I'm like, straight, here's the original scan. Here's the translation we have. Have at it, world.
Right. So I want to make sure our viewers understand, and so I understand. So your wife's father, he was a scientist, and there's physical drawings, engineering drawings, all that kind of stuff. But there was also a spiritual / disclosure aspect to what he was saying as well. So there's two halves here, kind of is what it sounds like. And for the spiritual end, I'm calling it spiritual. I just don't know how to
consciousness
based. Yeah, that's perfect. Where do you think, was that just his personal thoughts? Do you think he got that information from somewhere? Where did that end of it come from, you think?
So there's a combination, because again, this is a unified, internally consistent body of work, right? So he's not just randomly talking about things because it's the stuff he's interested in. He's explaining how it all fits together. And not only for the history's sake, but for the path going forward sake, right? Um and so there are elements that relate to what's called the news sphere and what Western analysts would always categorize as Russian mysticism in a sense. But what that said to me in reading it and looking over the entire history was that if the U and again, aspects of even the consciousness stuff are mirrored in things like Stargate and what we know about these government programs. So my assessment of that and the question that it raised, and I sort of try and frame and work things around as, information continually develops and new discoveries, sort of come while I'm doing all this. What I wonder is that Russia, the United States, I think both obviously done reverse engineering. I think that we can almost say is a settled issue. And I think Russia took a perspective of trying to understand this consciousness aspect of it and how do they advance that quicker. Whereas the US path was to engineer and use technology to circumvent the consciousness aspect. And that's why we potentially have a lot of cool technology that is probably a derivative of this NHI origins, but why we also haven't been able to purely replicate the craft because there is this consciousness aspect, and the consciousness aspect cannot be engineered. It is purely something that comes from civilization development.
Right. That's interesting because, like you said, the U.S. was primarily focused on the physical reverse engineering of a craft that doesn't seem like they made a ton of progress on, but the jury might still be out, whatever, you can argue either way. But they were also, I think, doing consciousness stuff as far as Project Stargate, remote viewing, other stuff. But you have to wonder, and I don't think there's a lot of data on this, but how much did those programs intersect? How much was this program talking to that program?
Right.
I'm not sure of that.
And I would imagine they didn't intersect at all because they each explored a different area. And why, if I have to come up with a hypothesis for it, what I would imagine is they ran multiple programs that had to do with consciousness concurrently to see which one worked, which one gives the best result. I was talking about it earlier when it comes to, just politics and negotiations. You'll have several teams negotiating several deals. Whichever best deal they can get to first, they'll settle on and then push the others aside. And that's where people feel like they got screwed and everything else. I think same strategy, right? It's the government. They have a MO, a modus operandi that they're going to work within. So I think that would fit the patterns and behavior.
Yeah, and I think that instead of having one big program, and this is where the classification and the need to knows can really hurt a program, because this program can't talk to this program. They can't share data. And I think it's really hard to make progress and put a whole picture together when, related teams that are working on two ends of a spectrum that are related aren't talking to each other. That
Right.
can slow progress by decades. And, maybe it seems the Russian programs were a little more integrated to where they can actually talk to each other.
Well, they were 100%, right? And that's what we learned as a result of the release, George Knapp, September, his testimony, and the Thread 3 documents and coming forward, right? The U.S. approach was compartmentalize, give everybody a piece of the puzzle to forward. And I've seen it play out in, I'm up to about 75 different programs now, where I say if I took these 75 programs and stacked them on top of one another, I can recreate my father-in-law's work, which is one unified body, right? So there seems along that chain of those 75 programs, progress, advancement, failures, all the rest. But then they just sort of, what's missing is the integration layer.
Right.
That everything in and of itself is standard, innocuous science, but the integration of it is what then goes into the black world. And I think that is consistent with the whistleblower testimony that we get, where what they're talking about and what they've either witnessed or been informed about through somebody else is the integration layer. And that's where, the uber secrecy, super secrecy comes. Whereas with Russia, we see there was one single program organized under the Ministry of Defense, broken down into two components, military and civilian research through the Academy of Arts and Sciences. The military goes out and collects the information, collects the sensor data, gets the witness statement, collects the materials, and then turns each part of that over to the competent scientific research branch. So you had weather, communications, radar, engineering, they all get their parts of it to, their subject matter expertise. And then it would come into some sort of integrated system. So this is the part that even within the Russian program and what George Knapp brought back, the public part that we see are the orders that establish it. We see some of the evidence of the witness statements, particularly that the Russians collected. And then what would come next is the engineering and analysis part of it, which I believe my father-in-law's work represents this integration layer coming together in a systems analysis and systems level physics to begin to piece all of it together. And then the next step to that would be the testing, which again, we don't see any evidence of the testing. Now, whether all of this exists in the body that went into DIA and Bigelow and OSAP and ATIP and all the rest of it is, the question to remain. But what we do see is the end product, right? So we've got visibility, the program existed. We've got, through my father-in-law's work, some indication of the engineering. It disappears, but then we see a product, and those products are patents. Those products are the programs that fell out of the science. So it's almost as though you can follow the scientific trail, and then there's a gap, and then there's an end result, and then some of that end result gets, buried again somewhere. It's almost like, watching a whale, a humpback whale, feed, right? Pops out of the water, you get some visibility, boom, it's gone.
Right. Yeah, and then that seems to be the story of disclosure. And, I'm not super familiar with the UFO disclosure community in Russia, but I wonder how helpful it would be someday, or maybe something like this already exists, but some researchers from the United States, form like a working group of Russian UFO researchers, American UFO researchers, shared data, shared documents like your father-in-law's work. I don't know if something like that's ever been done, but sounds like it could be pretty helpful.
Yeah, so there's actual evidence that it was happening at the government level, right? We know again the recent
Right.
Bob
Kennedy
Lazar.
wanted to share the documents with
Did he
the
want to?
Soviet Union.
Yeah, absolutely. That's come out. Bob Lazar, the S4 documentary. There's what I call my favorite 17 seconds, where he says yes, there were Russians working at S4 in 1989, and that they had something we wanted. And then there was some discovery, and suddenly all the Russians were gone. Um, we have, again, some reports out of, the former Soviet Union of this type of cooperation that was occurring. As far as Russian ufology, I mean, the preeminent expert, of course, Paul Stonehill, right?
Right.
And he has extraordinary detailed historical record and
Yeah.
timelines. I just ran through again a complete sort of review of all of his stuff, and where
He's
does
like a walking encyclopedia of Russian ufology.
he is, and I get his frustration, right? Because we're so America centric on this, and what he does and lays out, you can almost match the parallels. You can use what they were doing to fill the blanks in the US story. And
Right.
when you fill those blanks, again, on progress and development, it begins to give you insights of where to look. And people just haven't made that connection to be able to take that and perform these in-depth looks, or to get the clues of what to look for. Um, and I think it's true with a number of other countries too, right? So we got Paul that delivers that from Russia inside Russia. I think he knows some of the, whoever the key figures are. Certainly not as popular. There's certainly an attempt by the Russian government to downplay. Whereas through the period of the Soviet Union, they were very, very transparent about discussing on area phenomenon in these programs. That sort of has taken a turn. But we also have, we do the Sunday Syndicate, right? We've got Italy and how Italy addressed it. France has a long history of very open, very public methods to collect, share, process, and process data. But again, everyone just sort of gets in this U.S. centric zone, um, and doesn't look to other countries
Right.
not only for lessons learned, but again to put timelines in order. When you start mapping this out on a timeline collectively, globally, it becomes super obvious of an event, a period of denial, an increase in technology development, things that roll out of it. And you constantly see these cycles, and you see the advancements of science in certain fields related to this that are anomalous to science itself. The exponential leaps that are made within compressed timelines, that within the scientific method are anomalous. But nobody, but it's less it takes more brain power, and it's less sexy than looking at a photo or watching a video.
Yep, exactly. And in America and maybe the world, it seems like we have 10-second attention spans
Yeah,
anymore. And with disclosure, the whole thing, or not just disclosure, but the UFO subject, it's all about laying the pieces on a board, on a table, in thousands of pieces and fitting them together. And to do that effectively, you need an attention span, and you need to be able to pay attention to detail to see where the pieces fit. This happened in Brazil in whatever year. This happened in America the year before. Did we transfer technology?
right.
Whatever. But that's kind of so. Back, I just want to touch back on the book for a minute.
Yep.
So, are these just your father-in-law's notes, or do these consist of actual Soviet government documents or anything like that?
So, well, this is there you go. This part of the mystery. So these are his notes, right? Are those notes official Soviet records? One of the first things I did again was try to look for the hallmarks of classification, right? Easiest things are the stamps, the big, writing up top, secret, and things like that. Now, one of the problems, as again, I'd say is corroborated, with George Knapp's testimony, is they didn't do that the same way that we do in the U.S. They generally
Only stamped a Tom Page.
They put a cover sheet on it, and everything below that cover sheet was classified. One of the hallmarks, probably the only, if not the most significant hallmarks that are within my father-in-law's works, if you open the book to the first scan, is a pink piece of paper. And he has handwriting on that pink piece of paper. Within Soviet research, and that is the first sheet of paper. That is a visual indicator of something that is classified, or that work has some sort of standing. Now, it may differ between institutions, whether it was academic or government, but for him, coming out of the same academic system that is involved in Thread 3, he might not have the Soviet Ministry of Defense cover sheet to put on it, but this red piece of paper could be the equivalent of this. Everything underneath this is secret. And that would be a quick visual indicator to the KGB and the security and things like that. So there would, be that secondary thing of an ID card, an access level, or whatever. And so let's be honest, if I'm a uneducated security guard, sometimes illiterate, even in the 90s when I was working in the former Soviet Union, police were illiterate, right? But they can recognize pink. So long as they weren't colorblind, you could train them.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's sort of indicator number one. The other indicators in there, so there's three that I sort of lean on, right? The first is he references a video of a UFO that was recently in Earth's outer orbit and near the sun. So again, you can, putting it within the context of the Soviet Union, these weren't videos that would generally be available to or distributed amongst the general public, right? The VCR, things like that. So it's easier to conclude that, or the conclusion that would make more sense is that he saw some sort of official secret or classified video to be able to make that statement. And then the last part of it is actually tied to the portions of it that have to do with consciousness, where he directly references other works that he wrote for the Russian Duma, the parliament, their legislative branch of government. And he makes those references twice, which indicates to me that whoever these documents went to would also have access to previous papers that my father-in-law wrote that went to the Russian legislature. And so, again, Soviet Union, we don't have a public reading room. We don't have Freedom of Information Act. If you are telling somebody, and go look at the Russian Duma papers I sent before, that means you're talking to somebody with access to the Russian Duma and the parliament and things like that. So those are the key hallmarks that are in his own writing within these documents. There's a couple of other subsequent things from his social media where he talks about visiting this nuclear base in 1990. So again, indications that he would have the classification, the authority to be part of these types of visits. And there's another aspect of just the family history in general, which are indicative of people that would have access to and work within the government system and be considered very reliable, good party members, loyal, all of those things. So there's a sort of provenance and a family history that extends back to his grandfather, my wife's great grandfather, who was politically involved locally in Kazakhstan within a community that was both industrial and a military base. And they worked within those industries. The grandfather, my wife's great grandfather, was killed in the Battle of Stalingrad, of which having a family member who died particularly in that battle further elevated the family status. And so working in government, being in trustworthy positions for a party member, for a family member, is almost an obligation, right? It's an expectation that Mother Russia has of your trustworthiness and loyalty and all of those factors.
Yeah. What was his actual job title and who did he work for?
He was a plumber.
He was a plumber.
He was a plumber. As far as Natalia knows, he was a plumber.
So that threw a wrench into my brain.
Yeah. I mean, so that being said, if you ask Natalia at any point in her life, right, that's what she would say. Well, he went to this civil aviation academy that used to be a KGB school before like the early 1920s or whatever. He traveled around. He traveled back and forth to Kazakhstan. He worked at the Cosmodrome, their NASA. He was back and forth to Moscow. He had a pass for the Duma, the Russian parliament, living in Latvia. We found out after his death, for a period of time before Natalia was born, he worked and lived in a place called Priazursk, Kazakhstan, which is connected to this range called Shari Sungan, essentially the Russian Area 51, the Soviet Area 51, nuclear testing, ballistic missiles, suspected, UFO activity, and all the rest of it. What was his job? As far as we know, he was a plumber.
Yeah, that it doesn't seem like that holds water in reality. Who the hell knows?
I mean, so that's what I'm saying. Now, are you familiar with Eric Hecker?
Yeah, from the South Pole or whatever.
And he's a plumber.
Right. Yeah, good point.
And when we had a private, video call and I shared everything with him, his reaction was, he said, "What did your father-in-law do?" I said, "According to my wife, he's a plumber." And he started laughing and he's like, he understands plumbing. He said, "These drawings," he said, "this is how a plumber would define these things." And so it's that simplicity of the term plumber, but the complexity of things when you get into industrial level activities. And so the best interpretation, because of all of this, right? We could talk about advanced. He had the whole educational background. The bigger mystery.
That was my next question. What was his did he have an education?
Yes, he was educated. He was an aerospace engineer.
I thought so. Okay, so I'm not crazy.
Oh,
I thought so.
He fucking learned plumbing.
Right. I'm like, wait, I thought this guy was a scientist. What did I get wrong? Okay. So I was right. Okay.
Right. So in his social media posts, he describes himself as a nuclear scientist and a physicist. In his own words, I am a humble scientist and humble physicist. But as far as that knew, he was
strange.
When Eric Hecker looks at the work, he's like, yes, he's using. He said it's almost like he is just taken this systems integration approach to explain all of this stuff. When you look at the Eric Weinstein and Eric Davis argument about there's no physicists in the room, there's engineers, then it all starts to make sense.
Makes sense, right?
Because you're right. A physicist would, you can't understand the physics until you have mechanically engineered or understood the engineering first.
Yep. The hard work, if you're trying to reverse engineer something, the hard work is being done by the engineers, not the physicist, if you want to understand how something works.
Right. So you have now, I have my father-in-law, in his own words, in these social media posts, identifying himself as a nuclear scientist and physicist. And there's a large component of this craft that involves a compact thermonuclear system and stuff like that. Somewhere in there, he knew something about plumbing after the fall of the Soviet Union. That'll tell you, he used to go around and fix all the little old ladies, plumbing. He used to go to the university she graduated from, Riga Technical University, and do some things on the industrial systems there. But that is, again, the idea that his daughter only ever thought of him as a plumber who had an aerospace degree, engineering degree, yet he self-describes himself as a nuclear scientist and a physicist.
Totally bizarre.
That is a gap that is only explained really as cover stories.
Yep. Exactly right.
That
nothing else makes sense.
Right. Don't get your kid involved. Just tell her you're a plumber. And she used to say, of course, as she gets older, she's like, well, why does a plumber from Riga need to go to Moscow to work in the Duma? It's like literally.
They don't have plumbers in Moscow?
Right. It's literally the equivalent of Eric Hecker flying from Alaska to Washington, D.C. to do plumbing at the U.S. Capitol.
Right.
Why?
There's more than meets the eye is going on here.
Right.
Absolutely fascinating. So let's get a little specific. What exactly was in the documents that would you say is most notable, where you could point to and say, here, what would it be?
I mean, as far as revelations or whatnot,
yeah.
I'll go grab my edition.
Yeah.
I had mine nicely organized, so I can attempting quick like that.
Wow, jeepers! There's no question as to what we're looking at there.
And this was, again, you got to remember, we're sitting at the couch. We're sitting on the couch going through, essentially, 119, pages of, these notes, right? And then we get to like these words, and I'm like, well, well, what's this say, right? What's this? And that's little. Those three letters are UFO. Those are the Cyrillic translation, and that's like the technical specifications of the UFO. I'm like, a UFO? She's the UFO, and
Right.
and so this again goes into the whole the language that was used. And was it a theoretical exercise? Was he trying to guess?
Right.
But there there's language in there that's very specific. And so some people say, well, maybe they just did it that way. Well, maybe they did, but again, I got to keep going back to, if it was just a guess, then how does it align? Like, logic and reason should say it shouldn't match anything. There shouldn't be patents where the sciences align, where the parameters, where not even the science, where the numbers are in the ballpark, are similar, are it should be. Or if I told you, Joe, do your best to do your best to specify every detail of a UFO, I shouldn't find anything that does that, right? Maybe to a degree, if you have that scientific background. I mean, I can't, I guess, in your background, I could, talk about a mechanical vehicle. Hey, Joe, explain how this mechanical vehicle works. And there might be some things that you say are different, or, call it by a different name,
Right.
but it just like shouldn't randomly, something this random should not match anything. Not to the detail to which it does, not to the specific agencies that everybody looks at. Overall, there were like 42 different scientific topics that go through, and it touches thermonuclear, compact thermonuclear systems, nuclear fusion, magnetohydrodynamics, plasma containment, plasma creation, all these sort of things, which we hear an awful lot about in the broader discussions of UFO and UAP. Now, you've got to contextualize this as being, this was written in the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain from as early as 1980 through perhaps as late as 2007. If you looked at this stuff and the numbers of achieving, 16.65 Tesla and in 1980 or 2000, it's pseudoscience, it's fringe science, and all the rest. If we go to 2008, 2012, 2000, these things are being achieved, right? They've spent years trying to get there. And now they're achieving, he says 16.65 Tesla. We see programs that reach 20 Tesla. Programs, again, associated with, it's not like in a totally different field or anything like that, the usual suspects. So, one of the things was like I found a DARPA request for proposals, right? So DARPA puts out a solicitation that says, we are looking for somebody that can reach 16.65 Tesla. Where'd you come up with 16.65
Right.
Tesla? Why specifically that number? Now, the end result was like 20 Tesla, which is great. But why were you specifically looking for this? Why were you putting out a solicitation?
It's a hell of a coincidence.
It's, I mean, and believe me, I ran one day. I just was like, what is the statistical probability? And it was something, I forget the word, but it was like 10 to the 630th power,
Wow.
which means it's one with 630 zeros behind it chance that it could be it could be coincidence, or that it could be, it's, and it's that kind of thing. And I've gone through this with like some of the critics or people who want to, just foo anything that they haven't come up with. It's if you took any one area and there were matches, you could say it's parallel scientific development, right? That it's just the nature of science, that this one thing that anybody researching this field would ultimately come to. You can do that for any one of them. The problem is when there's three of those things in one set of research, when there's four of them in another set, when there's, two more up here, four here, six here,
It
that
sounds like an impossibility that
it
it's some
becomes
kind of coincidence.
statistically impossible, that there was not some sort of shared reference starting point. And so whether it was information exchange, information out of Russia to the US, information from the US to Russia, there's probabilities, reasonable probabilities in that. But what it's not is two people, two nations working totally independent. There is a point of convergence. So you either exchange that information because somebody each had a piece of the puzzle, or you both had the same starting point, which might be a recovered craft.
Right.
You each had your own and you got there, or any combination thereof.
Does it state anywhere in the documents what they were working on, what the source of what they were working on came from, like a recovered craft, anything like that?
Nope, no
Okay.
indication. There's, again, full transparency, there's, when I say the reverse engineering of a craft, that again is based upon the assessment of the totality of the documents and the depth at which, you would have to have in order to come up with the specifications, right? Because people have challenged, they said, well, could he have been looking at a photo? Could he have just been integrating data that was given to him? Um, and I can't rule those out, but in trying to assess the competing hypotheses, the one that continues to sort of be at the highest levels is some degree of hands-on physical presence, because no engineer wants to take another engineer's, measurements. If you've ever built anything, right? Nobody wants to start putting a saw to something based on your measurements. They'll put a saw to something based on their own measurements done twice, right? Before they're going to cut. But the likelihood that somebody's going to say, oh, you measured it, what was it? Great. Let me make this cut, is very low.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Sorry, I'm just trying to
Oh, go ahead.
get my video back on track. I don't know what is going on. It might be a little better. Okay, so it doesn't say, which obviously if we had proof of a recovered craft, it'd be breaking news on every news channel, which is why we're still working on trying to find evidence and provenance.
Yeah. So that being said, I'm sorry, not to throw you off or take you from your question. Now I've done, other people independently have come to me and have done assessments trying to see if there are reports of craft that had crashed and been recovered in Russia or the former Soviet Union, um, within the time period or previous to the time period. And so there are several candidates, probably the best one, which based on witness drawings and technical drawings done by witnesses are most aligned with my father-in-law's stuff, and that's from what they call Kapustin Yar. Um, so there's a few candidates, let's say, that would fit both in the timeline and based on witness reports of where the craft may have, what the source craft may be based, this work may be based on.
Okay. Um, so where are we with having physicists or engineers study this work? Has that happened, or do you plan on that, or anything like that?
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag, right? And I guess maybe it was my ignorance or just hope or whatever. I figure somebody's going to want to dive into this, right, and take it on and figure it out. I can't say that's happened with any degree of rigor. What's happened? So probably the most public facing group and individuals who have dove into it and who talk about it are the Falcon space guys. Jared Yates, sort of immediately recognized, I guess when he first saw it and saw, magnetohydrodynamic, he's like, oh, this had to be from the 80s. And it's like, yeah. Mark Sokol is, again, kind of gone through it. And he talks about it in terms of, I guess there's things in there that the way he's phrased it are informing the areas of research that they are already pursuing and invested in and things like that. So I wouldn't be so bold as to say, he found a secret nuggets that's helping him or whatnot. But I guess, and so we've got that. I've got Dr. Andrew Morgan out of Australia working on similar things. He's, gone into it and he's like, oh, hold on, this is, aligned with things that I've found and working on, and stuff like that. The Mass MUFON investigator, Jim Allrock, he's a mechanical engineer. He's gone through it and he's like, this makes sense. This is legit, along that line. Somebody else came forward and was like, if we can get $40 million, we can actually build the facility we would need to test some of this stuff. Because, and that's an interesting, I guess, bridge, because even my father-in-law in those works, he's explaining it, he's going through it, and he ultimately says, but this is 22nd century technology. Like, we don't have the tools yet that we would need to design and build the tools to be able to even test and begin to falsify some of these things. So that becomes that's a challenge in and of itself. Um, but other than that, I would get the skeptics' take, right? Are the people who, it's like, oh, I'm not familiar with this. Let me look, and they see a number and they're like, no, that's impossible. That's that, and those are the areas that I push back on, because I'm like, well, is it impossible according to what you know? is it impossible according to terrestrial physics and earth physics as we know it? And what about if we built this were built somewhere else? Would it still be impossible? And I've pursued that line of reason, and I've tried to exert, clues from what he writes, that if this really existed, where could it be built? Where would it need to be built? What are the characteristics of the place that this would be normal physics? And those answers come to the Jovian system and moons around Jupiter, which, if you listen to, Dr. Newth and others, they often talk about the Jovian system. They often talk about
Right.
Jupiter and the moons of Jupiter and this and that. So again, it's, I want people to get their minds around the idea that I've landed on these results, reverse engineering the reverse engineering. So here's the parameters you gave me. Where do these exist? Oh, these exist in order for this to be done and to achieve this, it would have to have all of these conditions. Where do those conditions exist? Oh, like in the Jovian moon system.
That's fascinating.
So, and so that's what continues to drive me, right? Because it seems to me from a I'm a good patriot standpoint, right? That there are legislators, there are people asking questions about all of these various aspects. And every one of those various aspects, I can find an answer to. And, I try to have enough hubris and humility to say, this is not the definitive document, but it is a tool, right? It's a sort of Rosetta Stone in a sense, because it's the only thing that's unified that can be measured against. And everything I've tried to measure it against, it seems to come out with an answer that's a theory somewhere else. So that becomes my point. It's like, maybe we can ask better informed questions. Maybe we can look in different directions or get more specific about where we should be looking and what we should be asking of in which agencies and which agency heads, and what kind of documentation might we be looking for. This begins to narrow all of those channels down. And the idea that to try and put it in front of the people that could do that and explain it to them, they kind of don't want to hear it, which begins to throw everything else in question about disclosure and the movement and transparency and who's who and what's what and who's motivated by what.
Right. It sounds like, it's kind of in limbo because it's going to take somebody dedicated to studying it, doing the science on it, and that's going to take resources and quite a bit of resources. So it's a big task to take on, and
Yep.
it's just a big job. So until then, it's just going to be people like you and fellow researchers doing what we can in a small part, but to really make real progress on this, sounds like it's going to have to get in a lab with resources behind it, with scientists behind it, and all out full court press to try to understand and prove or disprove some theories.
Well, right. And I think, that's if you consider that part of it important within the grander scale of disclosure. And this becomes part of my pushback as well, right? And this just might be gene intelligence, logic kind of thing. I don't even care if the math is right? I don't care if we can actually build this thing. What's significant to me is that it even exists in the first place, that there is a unified, internally consistent body of work when it comes to that math. Maybe it's wrong, but it's still consistent, right? It still works out within itself and within its own walls. Um, and that bigger question then is, if all of those things are true, it's unified, it's internally consistent, and it's talking about a UFO, and we can relate it to all of these things within the US government, then why are we not interested in having that discussion? Why are we not interested in breaking that down? So it's sort of this existence of it as a timeline, as a benchmark, as a utility is more important than, is the math actually correct? And
Right.
can we actually build this thing? It
Right.
has a lot more clues or answers to clues than the importance of it being right.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like there's two ends of the spectrum with this. What you're saying, and then there's the math part of it. But, is it somewhere in the middle? The math doesn't have to be right. It was a work in progress at the time that he was doing it. The math doesn't exactly have to line up. We're not saying, here's the proven finished product of a UFO.
Right,
Go build in the lab, you'll have a flying saucer with anti-gravity, whatever.
right.
It's not what it is.
This was somebody using the knowledge and language available to him in the time to try and explain how this thing works between 1980 and 2000 or whatever. Now we have a lot more science that's been developed that is even more advanced than and more mature. So,
Right.
the question of whether you want to build it or not is one thing, but the utility of it in this broader disclosure or a discussion about disclosure and about what was known and about where it is, I think that's the more important thing that all this can unlock.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think that leads me into my next question. Um, so in his documents, does anything of what was included, does it line up with what any whistleblowers have said, like David Grush or anybody else? Does it track?
So, I go through a few specifics on that. What I've been able to do is I've sort of tested and looked at this and challenged it even for the 60 most common reported phenomena around UFO sightings. For each one of them, this provides a scientific technical explanation of why that phenomenon occurs in relation to being exposed to a UFO or a UFO being in the proximity or the observations, right? Can explain each one of those. It does corroborate almost every whistleblower and witness testimony. So for everything that somebody comes forward and says, this is what I observed, we can provide a scientific explanation behind it. I would say the ones that it doesn't are the stories that are probably bullshit, right? And are probably
Well, yeah.
misinterpretations and things like that. But for the mainstream, most significant whistleblowers, particularly, um, if you compare the programs, we've got the body of work and the science, we've got the U.S. programs that they kind of relate to, we've got the whistleblower testimony, and from that testimony, if you begin to then distill where they were and the time frames that they were there, and you superimpose that over the programs that the public, at least the publicly identifiable programs that I've been able to extract from just the science, you can build a picture of what needs to be targeted where, as far as a congressional type inquiry, because it does corroborate those that testimony. Um, what the hell was the other part I was going to cover? And
It
then
gets
there's
back into putting the puzzle pieces together.
right,
These sound like some very important pieces of that puzzle, and they need to be included in the fuller picture.
yeah, and and that's why I say it's a bit disheartening to sort of have it all fall on me. Like, okay, I guess I've got to put this all together, and I've got to choose one at a time to do it. Um, where again, the sort of grander hope was that people would kind of get behind it and be like, hey, hold on, what do we
Right.
do with this? All right, let's do it. Great. We could probably, come out with a lot of stuff. But all of that is still for naught if the gatekeepers are keeping you from presenting it to the congressional representatives
Right.
and from getting it in front of them. I have all the results in the I have a lot of results, I should say, but nobody seems to want to see them or hear about them.
Right. And I think that's kind of what we're all trying to fight against is transparency.
Yeah,
Whether it comes from the UFO community, whether it comes from people in government, we need to have transparency in this subject, no matter who it is, if we're ever going to get anywhere where people can trust what is being presented to them.
yeah,
So,
or
we
yeah,
appreciate
or
you staying on it and not giving up on it and keep trying to get that information out there. What you're doing is very important.
yeah, and believe me, there's I mean, there's some days I probably cycle through where I'm like, you know what, I've done everything I can do. I put it out there. I'm going on with life, right? Like I don't need any of this and whatnot. But then I just go back. I'm like, but man, this is it's important. It's a little bit, yeah, it's a little bit of this. I've got to have the answer why, right? Like why? What is going on? Because I feel like even within the disclosure advocacy movements, there is a lack of transparency and there is a lack of interest and I mean, you've heard a lot of my criticisms that there is a vested interest in just continuing the pursuit of disclosure, and there is less appetite for actual disclosure. And there's a lot of structures and systems that exist that are dependent upon the pursuit. And part of my challenge is the fear that they're more afraid that there is an answer than just continue the pursuit because that's where the bread and butter is for too many people.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly an argument. I think you also have to look at I think, as in many things, there's a lot of things that kind of fall in the middle. Like you're saying, there probably is some of that, and I'm sure there is. I think there's so many strains of information coming from so many different directions. Focus on this, focus on that, focus on this, and it
How do
goes
you
back, I
prioritize?
think, also to an attention span,
Yep.
resources, and what to focus on. But I think there's probably a little bit of everything.
Yep.
And like we were saying, transparency is important. And if people are actively shutting down information, they should be called out if we have evidence and proof of it. Um, but yeah, but what we're talking about, we don't have a ton of documents or diagrams and you know, stuff from scientists that were in programs. So you would think this what's in this book and other materials would be a very important aspect of it that should have attention paid to it.
Yeah,
No
I
doubt
mean,
about it.
we listen. How excited is everybody about Bob Lazar's doodles?
Right. Right.
Right? How excited? Bob Lazar drew a picture of the craft that he saw. Right? Super excited about that. And then,
Meanwhile,
you're right. Meanwhile, you know, where's my thing? You know, meanwhile, you get that, and and I get the aliens told me that that's not how it is,
no, Jesus Christ.
and I'm like,
That stuff turns me off so bad when people say that. I
you
tend to
know,
discount them immediately whenever I hear something like
well,
that.
again, I've had several challenges, and um, several people have been like, "That's bullshit." Well, what part exactly?
The Galactic Federation told me that's not how it is.
Right. Or and again, no disrespect, but
No.
when people Jacques Vallée said, show me Jacques Vallée's reverse engineering, right? Show me, and this becomes, well, this is the crux of the second book that has fallen out of this in Fade Disclosed, which is the deep dive. So this is the treatise, so to speak, that really gets into the detail of the relationship to OSAP and Bigelow and the 38 DIRDs and all the rest of it. And when you do a direct comparison against the DIRDs, this is an engineered solution to the DIRDs. To a majority of the DIRDs, it directly provides an engineered solution. But let's get all excited about the DIRDs. Let's get all excited about the doodles. You know, I I don't. The only the only explanations are generally the lack of attention span, the unwillingness to engage something that is dense and scientific, and not easily digestible, um, or stupidity. I
Right.
mean,
And how much of it requires hard work before it turns into something you can get clicks from or views from,
that's right. I mean,
you know?
yeah, and that's the whole thing, because again, people are like, oh, you got to make videos, you got to do this, you got to, yes, but you know, listen, this is for a kid that failed algebra 2. This is pretty, time consuming to
Exactly.
not
Exactly.
only digest it myself, but figure out for myself what it means so that I can communicate it in the first place. And the fact of the matter is, I have no interest in creating videos and content and clips and stuff, which is why I tell the story to people like you, like Ty, like anybody, anyone who wants to talk about it. I'll explain it, the best I can. Um, I continue to dive in and do the heavy work, but I can't make it entertaining for you, right? I can't make it more entertaining than if somebody wants to come along and do it, have at it. Do it.
Right.
Get an Academy Award, get a Nobel Prize, do whatever. Invite me to the party. I don't need anybody's money. I don't need anybody's, I don't need
Right.
awards, nothing
Let's
like
just
that.
solve this thing or dive
Do the
into it.
fucking
That's all.
work, right? Just do
Right.
the work.
Yep. I could not agree more. Um, Let me ask you. So, if these documents are real, and not if we know they are, What
Right.
does that say about humanity's kind of technological timeline? Are we decades behind what governments already know, you think?
Uh, well, certainly yes, right? So, you always had this stand when I was in the military, you already knew and accepted that whatever it was that we had, whatever it was that we were being issued was already 20 years old, right? Whatever tech we were being given was already at least 20 years old, and the new stuff was being, worked on. I think people generally accept that idea. They generally accept there is a lot of stuff, a lot of technology that we understand, have access to, have developed, have prototypes of, and all of those things. And then the question, the rabbit hole question is, so why is it being hidden? Why is it being suppressed? And why so? And to me, the simplest answer often is the reality that it's cost prohibitive. It's cost prohibitive. We're not going to introduce it, and we're not going to talk about it because to bring it to mass production is cost prohibitive. And so the
Or
best we
profit prohibitive?
or profit prohibitive, exactly. And then perhaps the best we can do is small variations, small integrations that over time we are able to then roll out. So, it's just like your, NASA space pen or your rescue blanket. That's, the little thin thing that you keep
The
in your
Mylar.
glove compartment. That is NASA technology, right? At the time they developed that for the space program, it was probably cost prohibitive to bring out into the public and, make available for everybody to have a little blanket in their car. So, as you've eloquently highlighted throughout, this conversation, I think it's a universal truth. The truth is always somewhere in the middle between the evil oil companies don't want us having free energy and it's just plain cost
Too hard
prohibitive.
or cost prohibitive or we're not there
Right.
yet or any number of 100 different
Any number
things.
of. So, I think again, a lot of stuff we see is probably ours. I think the origins, my thing, my gig, my angle is the origins question. When it comes to disclosure and all of those things. And there's
All
a
it
path.
takes is one.
Yeah. Yeah,
All it takes
exactly.
is one craft not to be ours or
Right.
one visitation. It's all it takes. So why I'm sure the vast majority of stuff we see in the sky or satellites or, you know, classified tech, like we said,
Yeah.
all it takes is one. So
Yeah.
and that's kind of what we're looking for. Which leads me into, do you believe the Soviet Union ever reverse engineered a craft to completion?
To completion. By completion, you mean getting
A
it
working,
operational,
yeah,
a
like
working.
solved anti-gravity or whatever the technology is.
Yeah. So I've got to say no. I mean, I have no evidence that that had happened. Um, I have no reason to believe it had happened. I believe, again, even with the U.S., we're probably there. We're probably, could be, but I can't. I'm a guy that kind of likes evidence.
Yep. Yeah, I'm the same way. I'm just grounded kind of by nature.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between what I believe and what I think is possible. Intelligence to talk in terms of confidence. How confident am I that we've cracked anti-gravity and have something? I'm probably at a medium to medium high confidence
Me
that
too.
it's,
Same.
you know,
Sometimes I wish I was one of the woo people. It just seems like a lot more fun. Like I really wish I could believe this in the Galactic Federation and the Pleiadians. It seems like a lot of fun, but just
yeah,
by nature, I'm just not like I need evidence or something.
Well,
You know,
yeah,
my
and it's
rational brain, I don't discount it completely. I
right,
just can't. I just need to see something. That's all.
right. Well, and I wouldn't even I don't even go as far as saying I need to see something. I need the logic to work out,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because there is logic and structure within the universe. And if you begin to break down all of the quote unquote evidence of all of these things that everybody brings forward and everybody's versions of what they bring forward, I've said it before, if we did that and collected it, then the picture it paints of this galactic federation is actually a very chaotic organization that has absolutely zero control over any of the various things that people claim that it does. And we're probably better off as a species for not having any direct interaction with this galactic federation.
Right. If anybody's here trying to help us, they're doing a terrible job
They're
of it.
doing terrible, terrible job, right?
Right.
So,
And also, oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, and so as far as that, like, I'd love to be a woo person on that end. I think, in whatever the reality and definitive truth is, I think is much less sexy and much less interesting than everything that people think it's going to be. And I think you would potentially be super disappointed in the overall big picture
Yeah,
than
and that's in. I think
all
I
of the
might
interesting.
be. I think I might be the opposite. So I used to believe that. I think it might be we're just seeing a craft from deep space or whatever. But as I've gotten more and more into this, I am starting to come around to the interdimensionality aspect of it, and the aspect of religion, not religion as we know it, but
Yeah,
a spiritual side to it, like where we go when we die or where we come from. So I have come a long way from where I was to
yeah,
what I believe now. I do think that kind of stuff a lot more plausible now.
yeah. Of
But in the end, I don't think anybody really knows all the answers to it.
course not.
So I'm hoping we
They don't.
find out. We'll see.
And I
2027 will be here before we know it.
we'll
Maybe
see.
we'll find out.
I mean, I think, my sort of unified stance on everything now. Um, and again, I'm coming up on it, in June, it'll be 1 year that I've really been deep in it. But, my landing place now on where I am with all this, I'm like, you know what? I believe that, yes, I believe we are a vessel for a cosmic, spiritual, you know, uh, energy that resides within us, and whether we call it the soul or consciousness or any of these things, that the universe and reality is much there's much more depth and complexity to it, and for whatever that is, our purpose, my purpose right now, is I am here to have a human experience. And there is, and maybe there's a little part of me in the DNA or in this consciousness that recognizes there is something bigger and there is a larger connection and there is a larger thing that I am connected to. But essentially, I'm a kid at camp right now who's supposed to be having this Earth camp experience, and that perhaps we are doing more harm to our universalness and our universal and cosmic soul and knowledge by continually trying to get to the telephone to call back home and see what's going on, as opposed to focusing on the experience that we're supposed to have right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think a lot of us kind of could find ourselves there. Let me ask you this, Jane. Coming from a government background and just your experiences in life, who do you think really controls the information? Is it elected officials, a hidden government, the deep state? Who do you think is truly gatekeeping the information?
So I think it is so disjointed, and it has been so compartmentalized. I don't think I don't think anyone who has access to any one piece of the information, or even any group of people that possess several pieces of the information, actually know or understand who controls it. They know that they control their one piece, and what it would take, and or what release of their piece might mean, and that their job is inherently to defend that piece that they have. But I think this has been ongoing for so long and spread among so many um, institutions and the individuals who have filled these roles. And I think certainly the majority of those are career bureaucrats, career officials, within the agencies, um, that are the let's say the continuity aspect of it. But even within that level of continuity, there has been such a change between the handwritten and typewritten paper trail that was originally established, that the institutional knowledge of people that have died and moved on from those jobs, and that it is just so, the waters are so murky and muddied right now, it would really take a Herculean effort to get to the whole truth.
All right. So you don't think there's an MJ-12 type of organization that it has
There,
is overseeing the whole picture?
there very well may be 12 people each who have their 12 pieces, and I think whoever those are today probably have an incomplete picture themselves.
And I think that's a good point, because if we know anything about human nature, it's controlling the power that and protecting the power that you possess. So
Right,
it's not in your interest to share all your information with these other department heads, because that's
right.
less leverage that you have in protecting your own position. So
Yeah, I would say
I
if
think that makes sense.
MJ12 came, if MJ12, if it's 12 of them, all came out and sat around a table and put everything they had on the table, I think we still have an incomplete picture.
Yep. And because all 12 of those people are going to be trying to share as little as possible with the other 11.
That's
You
right.
know?
And their 10 predecessors before them. It's like, working when I was working in government, the Homeland Security was stepping up, right? Myself and colleagues, we went in and taught Homeland Security about security in the chemical and petrochemical sector. Homeland Security then created a presentation and went to police departments and taught them about chemical and petrochemical facilities and what they needed to do to protect them in the area. And then the local police were calling me up and saying, "Hi, we're going to tell you about how to do." Motherfucker, you know what I taught Homeland Security, right?
Right. You're not telling me
I
anything.
I still have a whole lot of shit I haven't told Homeland Security. I still have
Right.
all sorts of aspects of things, right? So believe me, what you know is a much diluted version of what, but I'm giving you what you need to do the job. I'm
Right.
giving you
Exactly.
what I should actually even correct that phrase. I am giving you what I need you to have for you to do the job I think you should be doing,
Yep.
and what's important to me for you to be doing. But you by no means have the complete picture.
Right. I'm not telling you everything I know, because there's no
Right. And
need
I'm
for you
not
to
doing
know
it
that.
out of spite. I'm not
No,
doing it out of
it's just how it works. It's human nature.
right.
It's how it
I'm
works. You're there
I'm
to
doing
do
it
a particular job.
right. I'm telling you the things I want you to know because I need something out of it.
Right. Yeah,
And these are
exactly
the
right.
things you can do to make my job easier.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
And then that's just how it works, whether it's government, whether it's the boardroom at McDonald's, it doesn't matter. It's just human
exactly.
nature.
Exactly.
Um, so, Gene, after all of this, do you believe history books eventually are going to need to be rewritten about where humanity comes from, what our origins are? How
Yeah.
big does it go, you think?
No, absolutely. I think, everything that it points to and everything people are concerned with and talked about, I think are totally valid. I think the, uh, you know, again, like I'm fascinated with Beatrice Villarreal's work and the transients, and was there stuff up there beforehand, and
Yeah, it's
what does
fascinating.
that mean, and what does that indicate? And I look at what we're doing with Mars. I'm like, well, we're doing the same thing with Mars, right? We send up probes, we send them around, we satellite, we research, we go, and it's like, is this just a giant cycle?
Right. Are we going to go
Yeah,
up there and find something we put there thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago? Who knows?
right. Or in thousands of years, are everybody living on Mars going to hear these stories about this Earth civilization, and
Right.
when people moved between Earth and Mars and they regularly communicated, and then there was some catastrophic event on Earth, and what could that have been, right?
That's the kind of stuff that'll make your brain hurt when you start
Yeah,
getting into that territory. It's
yeah.
endlessly fascinating. Gene, where can people find you?
Yeah, so the right there at the website and the name engineeringinfinitybook.com. So again, the papers, every diagram, this entire book is there in a flip book format to examine, to go through. There's a link to the archive, which is every individual scan with summaries. Everything's translated, everything's in English. I even have a second edition of translations coming out where we're transcribing the handwriting into Russian Cyrillic typing and then translating that into English to get
Wow.
an even cleaner, more specific translation, done. Um, on engineeringinfinitybook.com, there are uh, critical analysis of each one of the works, which again are sort of summaries. There's analysis of what is provable right now scientifically, and what is, what is needed to be done to get it there. So there's tons of resources there to do deep dives, whether you want to try and apply it to your own area of research in ufology and see what you can learn from it, or if you want to go down the same road and examine what is it that this can tell us about what our own government might know and might be done. I try to make all those resources available. Again, from there, then it links to the X, and I'm on there a lot, and I do
Where
spaces.
can people find you on X? What's
It's
your name on
at
X?
Yeah, so it's at Infinity Disclosed, DISCLSD. Leave out the E, or just put in
I'll have
Gene
for
Sticco.
everybody watching. I'll have it linked at the bottom, so just you can find Gene there. I'll have everything he's doing linked in the notes of the show.
Yeah, so I try to be, I get on there not only for some of the entertainment value, but
There's lots of that.
just to be available and accessible, for anybody's questions and things like that. And throughout there's emails, 100 ways to find me, and I'm here, I'm available, happy to engage with anybody. Like I said, I'm happy to have thoughtful engagements. If you want to come and just be like, it's bullshit, I mean, I'll engage with you.
Right, right,
You're not gonna fucking win, but
right.
I'll engage with you if you want. If I'm
Man, everybody out there, I know Gene. He's a great guy, very intelligent guy. And if you have, like he said, thoughtful questions or you want to converse, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gene, thanks for joining us. For everybody out there, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can get UAP Reporting Center merch. The link will be in below. That's our coffee mug, brand new. We have hoodies, we have t-shirts, and more to come. Here is one design, our logo for UAP Reporting Center. There's a bunch of other designs as well. You'll see the link in the show comments. You can find UAP Reporting Center on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, but I'm most active on Twitter, so you can find us there. Like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment. If you leave a comment, if you have questions or anything that you want Gene to answer or myself, leave them in the comments. I'll get your questions to Gene. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to get an answer to anybody who has a question. But thanks for everybody for tuning in. This is Beyond Top Secret by UAP Reporting Center, and we will see you next time.